How should and how can participants be meaningfully involved in research? This is not a new question. Nonetheless, it's one that is increasingly being seen as important. It's one that's currently receiving a great deal of attention. Now, a lot of that attention remains abstract and theoretical. What then are researchers actually doing? Hello, my name is Martin Lipscomb, and I'm joined by an old friend, someone I trained with, an assistant chief nurse at University College London Hospital Trust and NIHR senior research leader, Alison Finch, MBE. Alison has recently completed her PhD, and this is titled Experiences of Teenage and Young Adult Ambulatory Cancer Care, Community-Based Participatory Research to Inform Service Provision. Dr. Finch's work is interesting for a number of reasons. However, I've asked Alison to talk about the way in which she involved participants in the study. In my view, what was done well, and I suspect other researchers might learn a great deal from her. Alison, thank you for joining me, please. Can you outline how participants were involved in the work? Why did you do what you did? What did you hope to achieve by involving participants, and what benefits were derived?
Thank you, Martin. It's a great pleasure to chat with you today. So, first of all then, thinking about why young people were involved in this research, it's almost as if they were involved in the pre-research, because before the research had even been designed, at the point of being conceived, young people were consulted about their views and their thoughts around the research questions. So this research that we're talking about, just to help you now, it's rooted within the teenage and young adult cancer specialty. And this is a specialty of practice that has evolved over the last 30 years in the United Kingdom. And we recognise young people and young adults as having their own needs from a service provision perspective, and one that encompasses their developmental stage of life. And this subspecialty of cancer practice has always valued the principle of participation. So there's been a common thread there. So it almost felt intuitive when I was thinking about embarking on this piece of work to involve young people. And I guess that speaks, Martin, to this sense of design integrity, but also to the question being posed and the very nature of the research being proposed. So this particular project was about what's called ambulatory cancer care, where we've been involved in transitioning quite complex cancer treatment from an inpatient setting to a setting where young people can stay in a residential space overnight. That could be their own homes, it could be a hotel or a halfway house home from home. And so the research by its very nature was quite applied, and it was about informing practice and informing services. And that's not to say that we weren't interested to understand conceptually what was going on, but primarily it had a very practical application. And so why did we involve young people? And I very consciously also use the word we, because this was a participatory research project. And I guess I saw myself as the facilitator and as the lead, and if it's helpful, we can talk a bit more about leadership in the context of participatory work in a moment. But we was the collective. And so there was representation of not only young people, but also family members, national charity partners, academics and professionals who all came together to really explore the experiences of those who engage in this ambulatory cancer care pathway. And that was something that had been, although the service had been running for over 10 years, it was a piece that we didn't really understand. We knew that it helped support bed capacity in the NHS, so people getting on-time cancer treatment. And we knew that there was sort of a financial benefit potentially that's associated with this pathway. But the question of meeting needs and experience hadn't really ever been attended to. Martin, help me by understanding the other component of that question.
Tell me more about how you brought them into the study and how they played such a vital role in what occurred.
So the foregrounding to this work was a piece of patient public engagement that really helped hone the questions that we wanted to pose. But there was a different community of young people. And if we think about young people who were involved in particular in this conversation, who then came on board. And those young people didn't necessarily have to have their own experiences of this care pathway. And in actual fact, those young people were geographically from quite a broad area, extending out to Wales. So they were young people who had experience of their own cancer treatment. And really, I, through the national charities, put a call out to see who potentially might be interested. And 9 people came forward. Interestingly, of those people that expressed interest, I think there was more weighting towards females. And that was something quite interesting that I reflected on during the course of the work. But they came with not only their own experience of cancer treatment in different contexts, but they came with their other experiences. And some of those young people had, they were in the process of undergoing, university education or experiences from work. And I think when we think about contributions of lay people, lay by no means uninformed. And so there's then this wealth of different knowledges that can contribute to the research inquiry. And that's something that we really leveraged, and that was critical to the work. It was community-based participatory research, as you stated when you introduced this. I'm not going to go into too much detail now, but it's essentially a collaborative inquiry, and in which people who might be affected by the topic are involved in every stage of the design, the delivery, and the dissemination of the work.
Okay. Could you say a little bit more about that involvement, something a little bit more concrete though, because what you did was actually jolly interesting.
So we worked together as a community of practice, and actually something I sort of moved beyond the thinking around community of practice to describe us as a community of inquiry, to really foreground the intent of our work together. And if we think about the young people who are involved, they were not only involved in really sort of helping hone the research aims and objectives, but they played a very practical role in the conduct of the study. So, for example, they were the ones who were undertaking interviews with other young people, the participant group. That's just one example. I can see that you might want to ask something more about that.
That's such an interesting thing, because that's novel, isn't it? And how did you prepare them for that, and how did you support them in doing that?
I wouldn't necessarily say that it's novel. I think it's something that increasingly is being undertaken, but you're absolutely right. I think for engagement to be authentic and for it to be integrated, there needs to be appropriate preparation. This was a nationally funded piece of work, so it had the benefit of having an allowance, a budgetary allowance to do this well. And so I partnered with an academic in a different institution, and we put together, I say training package, but I think somehow training sort of infers this sort of didactic delivery of information. It wasn't. So we put together a series of workshops, and they had intended to be delivered in person so that we could relationally get to know one another. But of course, this was mid-COVID by this point now, so they transitioned to an online format. So over a period of a couple of months, we came together, we prepared people, not only thinking about the research approach, its principles, and how it was scaffolded, but also the methods that we would use, thinking about ethics in the context of this research, thinking about consent and how they would be involved in the consenting process, and then thinking about the interviewing techniques. And we did sort of real life the practices of that, and how and troubleshooting, and so it continued, and those young people then involved in participatory data analysis, which probably is a little bit more unusual on my part. And I think one of the things that's often levied around this type of really engaged work is for the lead researcher, for want of a better word. It's quite time intensive, and it can involve a lot of emotional kind of work, I guess, in some sense. And yet, of course, I think for those of us who are nurses, this is not that dissimilar from how we work in practice. So for me, this didn't feel effortful. This felt very comfortable, but also, I guess hadn't recognised this as being something that other people might find difficult or time intensive, because I think the relational basis to this work fits really well with our sort of our professional I'm struggling for words here, Martin, but that sense of how we enact
Yes,
our practice and the very essence of nursing.
I understand what you're saying, and I get what you're saying there. Can I drag you back a little bit to the way in which the young people were involved in the initial stages of analysis? How did that play out? What actually occurred?
So when thinking about analysis, the intent from the outset really had been for that to be a participatory endeavour, which sounds all well and good, but then becomes quite tricky to enact in practice, because quite a lot of analytical approaches could require quite intense training to prepare people. And that's not to say that individuals from diverse backgrounds and interests couldn't engage at that level. But I think within this way of working with young people who were volunteers, what you don't want to do is inadvertently weight them with a lot of work that's going to take a lot of time. And so it's a bit of a balancing act in terms of appropriate preparation and engagement, and not over expecting of those individuals. And so we worked with a analytical approach that really intended to move beyond a thematic presentation of the findings to consider conceptually what was going on around these young people's experiences of care. Also staff experiences and family experiences, but here and now we're thinking about the young people's experiences of care. And again, it was a workshop model, Martin, so there was some preparatory reading, there was some preparatory Zoom type conversations, and then we came together over a series of 5 workshops through which we very practically engaged with the transcripts in pairs and then coming together. And what I haven't said is that this research used visual methods, so the young people who took part were invited to take photographs of different aspects of their experience, which they then shared in that interview conversation online with the young person. So there was a component of visual analysis as well, and we surrounded ourselves by the photographs as well as the narrative.
Okay.
And then thinking about the conceptual findings, there is that balance between my role as a facilitator, as somebody who is more connected with the literature, and those who contribute their personal experience.
Okay, it was a really interesting piece of work that you did. Let me ask you. Let me come back to part of what occurred and ask you a question. Firstly, just to be really clear, I'm entirely in favour of meaningfully including participants in the research process when that makes sense, and it probably often does or could make sense. However, I can imagine possible problems, and I'd like to ask you a question about one of those potential problems. Now, based upon personal experience in education, service users, a dreadful phrase, but when service users are invited to share their experiences with students, sometimes those experiences include assertions that are of disputable accuracy, and they can include forms of normative judgment that might be questioned. However, it can be very difficult to dispute and question what's said by someone who's been invited to share their experience. Now, by analogy, when researchers meaningfully include participants in the research process, how will differences of opinion and differences of analysis be handled? Now, ultimately, I suppose I'm asking about who makes decisions. Is the researcher surrendering authority when participants are paid more than lip service? And does this matter?
It's a very, very interesting question. So in response to does the researcher in this context, me as the lead researcher, surrender authority? know, but I think it does require a letting go and a sense of curiosity and a respect and a deep respect for others' knowledge and others' type of knowledge. And again, it kind of goes back to the question. Not all research is suited to this type of inquiry, as we know and as we respect. And I think I'm going slightly around the houses, Martin, but I think, is there something around young people's agency and how this informed their contributions to the analysis, for example? Whereas if we were working and seeking the views of somebody later in life, are you potentially more cynical, more hardened? Do you have a different perspective and view that then contributes to that discussion and dialogue? I don't know. I'll kind of hold that there. And agency was something that kind of we worked with as a concept through this research. The other thing, I guess, is this type of research really upholds the principle of democratic participation. But like any research, it's not the end, it's not finite. No. It's not like this is done now and that's it. Like any research, what it offers is something that's contextual and something that will evolve. And so those perspectives are open for challenge through a different lens. And I don't think it would ever claim to be all and everything.
Okay. Alison, I think what you did was really interesting, and thank you very much for agreeing to talk about your work. I think people who look at what you've done will be impressed, and I think they will take a great deal away from what occurred. Thank you for talking to me.
Pleasure, Martin.